So, who wins on November the 5th could be absolutely crucial for Ukraine and, for that matter, for NATO. Let's discuss this with my guests. I'm joined by Kurt Volker. He's the former US ambassador to NATO, but he's also the former US special envoy for Ukraine. And Anatol Lieven is also with me. He's director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. First, I'd like to ask you both where we are in this conflict, because it's been going on this stage of the conflict since February 2022. That's over 2.5 years ago. Ukraine initially held out very strongly. They even had an offensive, counter-offensive in 2023. But since then, a grinding war of attrition. And Russia's been making slow gains, haven't they, Kurt?
That's exactly right. So in eastern and southern Ukraine, Russia has been making some incremental gains on the ground. Ukraine has taken territory inside Russia in the Kursk region, which I think they envision as some kind of territorial swap when there is a negotiation at some point. Russia continues to bomb Ukrainian cities and infrastructure and civilians every night using Iranian drones and using North Korean artillery shells. And Russia has just brought some North Korean troops into the fight as well, currently fighting in Kursk. It's not going, none of this is making a meaningful change in the state of play, but it is incrementally moving in Russia's direction as they take more territory.
Let me ask you, Anatol, about that Kursk offensive, because I remember we did a programme of our Inside Story programme just after that took place, and it was very surprising, it was very bold, seizing this territory inside Russia, and I think you said at the time the jury's out whether this will be a successful move. Well, we've now gone almost 3 months on. Was this a sensible move by Ukraine, or was it a distraction and they're now losing ground in the areas of Ukraine that really matter?
I'm afraid now it does look like a distraction, because they have actually been driven out of most of the territory they took in Kursk. And meanwhile, of course, as Kurt said, they are falling back in the Donbass, though, only slowly, and inflicting, but also unfortunately suffering heavy casualties in the process. Part of the problem is, we've had many reports from the Ukrainian front line about their suffering, their shortage of numbers, their shortage of ammunition. But of course, we haven't got that kind of information from the Russian side. So we don't really know how well they're doing. All we can do is track changes on the ground. I would be a little bit cautious about the North Korean story, because that hasn't actually been confirmed by US intelligence that they've gone into action in Kursk. All we've had confirmed is that some of them are training in Russia. So I think we have to wait to see what happens. Certainly, if the Russians were trying to use North Korean troops, that would be a sign of serious shortages on the Russian side.
Kurt, we had President Zelenskyy come to the United Nations and then a tour in the US. He has a victory plan, he says. He has a shopping list of what he wants. He says he can get victory by the end of next year. Tell us what he wants and whether you think it's at all realistic.
Well, I think what he's trying to do is answer some of the criticism that was coming from the White House here and also in some quarters in Europe, saying that, well, why do you need to fire weapons at longer range? What difference is that going to make? How is this going to reshape the war? So we put it together as an effort to say, look, we need more ammunition. We need longer range use of that ammunition.
And if he fired weapons into Russia, would that actually, do you think?
I think it would make a difference. I think it would force Russia to react to that. They are already on their own with their own drones hitting military targets inside Russia. But with some of these missiles that the U.S. has provided, to be able to go longer range into Russia, I think, would make a difference in terms of logistical supplies, support, fuel, airfields. And that is packaged not just by itself, give us more, but saying we need to do this to push Russia back, to get Putin to a point where he is ready to then accept some kind of solution. And then at the end of that, when there is a end to the fighting, then you bring Ukraine into NATO, the European Union, and that makes a permanent peace. That was basically what his plan was saying.
OK. Anatol, let's just quickly look at the two candidates. Kamala Harris, from what I can see, wants to keep, for now, it seems, the Biden policy. Isn't there a problem if, as you've already said, the Biden policy isn't really working?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that sooner or later, any American administration is going to have to negotiate. And indeed, they have said that. Trump will try sooner. Harris will have to try in the further future. But of course, there are many questions. One is, if she does indeed agree that, remember, American-guided missiles should be fired deep into Russia, how will Russia respond? I mean, that could bring on a cycle of escalation that would create a crisis in US policy much sooner.
Okay, let me turn to Trump, Kurt, because you did resign from the job, but you were his special envoy for Ukraine. He's said, I want the war to stop. I want to negotiate a deal. He's gone further than that. He said, what deal can we make? It's demolished. The people are dead. The country is in rubble. Right. You know this mercurial and transactional president. You know that you were involved in this. I mean, it was part of his impeachment. Do you think he's got something that colours him against Ukraine because of that? And we also know some of the positive words he said about President Putin. How worried would you be about a Trump victory?
Well, I'll start with Anatol was and then get there, because the fundamental issue is that there's a war in Ukraine because Putin has decided to attack Ukraine and continues to do so. And whether it's Harris or Trump, if you want to end the war, you've got to convince Putin it's not worth it. He should stop attacking and accept some kind of settlement. So what any administration, Trump or Harris, is going to have to do is put more strength into the Western position to show Putin it's never going to work. I don't see that coming out of the Biden administration. Harris has not talked like that yet. Trump, we have to see what he would do, but I think he understands that, and he has
You are not worried he will pull the rug completely from President Zelenskyy?
Quite the opposite, actually, because when you hear from President Trump, he said a couple of things recently. One, it's terrible, never would have happened if he was president. He met with Zelenskyy in New York around the time of the UNGA and said afterwards there needs to be a peace, and it needs to be a fair peace. And he said the first thing he would do is call Putin and tell him to stop the war. So it's clear that he doesn't want a failure in Ukraine to be his failure, just as he looks at Afghanistan as Biden's failure.
OK, Kurt, Anatol, thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. Now,
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.